So now that the season's over, I'd like to just sort of go through and review it as a whole. You can go through each team and look at how I think they went, how I think each manager went, as well as sort of go over and review myself and any sort of improvements that I'd look to make if I would ever host this again. Just sort of format improvements to try and improve it overall. But yeah, so congratulations to Omar for winning, taking our X-Elix in the final there quite convincingly. He didn't quite get the total EHP that X-Elix managed to get in the final of the first one, which I think was 711, but the EHP rates were a bit different then, and lavas were used quite heavily. So good on him for managing to pick a team that stayed strong the whole season and was able to take it out at the end. So I'd like to go through each team individually, starting out with my team. I suppose my team, I managed it, I suppose. Team Hexus, which was sort of a last-minute inclusion. I had teams under the 12 teams, so I had 11 managers, and I wanted an even number, and there was nobody looking to manage who I wanted to do so, and I didn't want to try and force anybody into doing it, like ask them to do it and have them not really want to, because having somebody unwilling is just kind of difficult and makes the overall competition less competitive, which this didn't quite solve, but I think it was a good idea. Early drafting probably could have been done a little bit better, but in the end it was kind of a filler slot, kind of an idea, conceptual slot. If it was ever done again in the future, some slightly more intelligent drafting could be done. Not to say that the initial draft was terrible. There were some good players picked up, like the MVP of the team, Kat Melissa, who people were telling me, "Nah, don't pick her, get someone else instead." But I stayed strong, and we made sure to get Jicklum's girlfriend on the team. I've heard they since broke up, so that's quite unfortunate, but I do appreciate the work she put in to pretty much anchor Team Hexus. I also think that Team Hexus had the strongest mid-season draft, picking up Harakame and Kawaii Machine, who both put in team best efforts and managed to almost take what would have without a doubt been the upset of the season, taking a victory over the eventual third place finisher. I think that would have been awesome, and I'm quite upset with him for stealing that victory from us. Not a very nice thing to do. But yeah, Team X, I mean, obviously finished 12th. There wasn't really any sort of hope that the team would finish well, but I don't regret the decision to include the team. Next up is Team X-Elix, who finished second in regular season and second in competition as well. And he did well. He did well. Going into the season, looking at the initial draft plan, I sort of thought that he would, obviously I thought he would go well. I thought he had a decent chance of taking it, and he sort of got a bit unlucky with some of it. In particular, losing Pano, who was his first round pick. And losing a first round pick can be extremely dangerous. Obviously, pretty much gimping his entire team. Who was his second round pick? He's replaced it there. He had Animos, who also dipped off at the end there, didn't quite quit to the same extent as Pano, but did drop quite a lot. Also lost Hordelad. Absolute fuckwit. Lost him in the semi-finals. He probably could have contributed a lot. And he basically lost Andrew Wiggins in the finals because I think he decided to be a fuckwit and go do Redwoods, which is unfortunate, but I can't help but see that as a managerial issue, playing someone who was obviously not going to be putting up the hours. I think he had a good draft and did well in terms of trading, perhaps too well. I had to give him a stern word and politely request that he not continue trading the same players back and forth in order to pick up people, but he did manage to get Michael and Sens out of that, which actually put up identical averages. Those were two very good pickups for him. And I can't remember who he got at mid-season. Was it? Got himself at mid-season, so it's obviously a good pickup. I'm not sure if he ended up using himself, but that's always a good one. So in terms of just straight up managerial nous, in terms of picking players, I think he was maybe top. He just got a bit unlucky with some of his decisions near the end of the season. Team Bront was obviously a good team, finishing 4th in standings, and I guess you'd call it 4th in this. Yeah, I thought about asking if Ryers and Bront wanted to do a 3rd, 4th playoff, but I couldn't be bothered, honestly. So I'll just say he finished 4th. I think he could have gone a bit better. He could have finished a bit higher in regular season if he didn't keep falling asleep before submitting his team and playing a couple of players who didn't contribute much in later weeks, such as this lovely week here in the final week where he narrowly lost and could have quite easily won if he'd played. I think Adam played quite a lot that week and he didn't have in his starting lineup. It was just a randomised lineup. Anybody who didn't submit their lineup on time just got 7 random players. That's how it worked out. But yeah, Team Bront went pretty well. Picked up 2 people he never ended up playing on purpose. I think this guy was put in there. And then Hugh Who played, was it once? To no particularly great effect, so I wouldn't say he did too well in terms of mid-season pickups, but 4th place finish is still pretty good, and it was one of the more successful teams, obviously. Team Duration, obviously the winner, did well. Drafted a solid core of users who were able to put up high reliable hours, so good on them for that. Kind of carried by a few powerhouse players. I know Tenu was playing quite a lot early on, so was he, and sort of dropped off near the end, which definitely lowered their averages, but he was one of the ones with the more solid cores. Definitely benefited quite a lot from trades. I'll talk about that a bit later, but he did benefit quite a bit from a trade, which, while unfortunate, is okay. I don't mind the fact that it happened. Overall, obviously, successful team, finished 1st, put up the single best week with 700 hours to beat Team Marco, and I think that was the 2nd highest anyone scored in regular season, so good on him for taking out the season win. Good job. Team Joa seemed to be one of the more together as a teams. He was always good and regular on getting his lineup submitted, which I appreciate. Didn't quite pan out in terms of success. I think the only 3 wins he got were against the 3 bottom teams, so that's quite unfortunate. That week 1, an absolute thumping. He got close there, close there, close there. One there, not close there. So he was another one of those ones that was quite unfortunate, often within 40 or so hours of taking a win. So if things had been slightly different, he definitely could have finished the season off a lot better. Again, anchored by a few key players. He had Nicky Boy 360 near the start, traded for Animos near the end of the season, who was putting up quite a bit. Broads was obviously his 1st round pick. I think that was honestly one of the worst 1st round picks. It was obviously near the end of the round, but I think just looking at the other 1st round picks, I'd definitely say it was one of the worst, considering who was still available in the 2nd round and beyond. But good on him for sticking to it and continuing to manage his team right up to the end. Then we go into Team Maffa. who finished 10th, and I'd like to say they did well, but they had quite a few rough defeats in there. Not many were overly close. He was basically the eternal 10th place team, which is unfortunate because he had a couple of good players. He made a couple of good moves with trades early on in the season. He picked up some decent enough players in the mid-season, but things just didn't quite pan out, and he obviously ended up finishing 10th with one victory over. Who did he have his victories over? He had one over Quaffle. Who was the other victory over? Joa, maybe? Oh, he picked up the victory against Marco in that last week there. Right, so those were his two victories. Almost won a couple, but overall just kind of failed to get the power players in the draft. In terms of initial drafts, I'd say like this was probably the biggest power play for anyone drafting any player, and it didn't quite pan out as intended. And I really think there was a wasted slot that could have been spent on someone else, but it's in the past now. Now we come into Team Marco, who was a bit of a disaster, really. Came in all guns blazing, putting up big wins. Narrow win over big narrow win there, easy win there, big narrow win there, narrow loss there, but still big hours, And then he quit, and that's when things sort of started going to shit. He stopped playing, stopped submitting teams. Started submitting random teams for the first couple of weeks, and then I ended up asking him if he wanted to continue. He said no, so I just started submitting his top 7 each week because I couldn't be bothered finding someone to manage a team that was, for all intents and purposes, out of the playoff race, definitely out of the high position race, seeing his, he had a team so heavily centered on heavy hitters, and he quit. And he traded away his other heavy hitter, and he was left with no real base to fall back on. So, bit of a disaster. Played well at the beginning. I think he got was his final loss streak. Where are we, Marco? Yeah, he lost the last 5 out of his 6 losses, so that was quite unfortunate. Team could have done a lot better if the manager didn't go AWOL. Remember to avoid e-girls at all cost. Team Pause was probably like the most bizarrely consistent team out there. They're all in the 70 to 80 range, which is great. You can expect to do well with that, but just kind of lacked the backup beyond that, and lacked the people to put in the big hours when it was needed. So I said that trance music in the second round was the worst draft decision, but I'm going to take that back and say that Link's Titan in the first round was the worst draft decision. When you compare every other first draft other than the joke ones, this guy 86 average, 80 average, and himself, which is obviously very valuable, 104 average. Broad's not a great draft pick. He picked Marco, which he then traded for Frozen Dame, 87 average, 82 average with himself, which then dropped off a bit, and etc. You're normally looking for somebody who can both give you that high 80-ish sort of average and put in the big weeks, which is why I think that Link's Titan was a bit of a waste of a first draft, and sort of just pushed along by the hype rather than actual thinking. But the team overall went well. 5th place finish, 7-4. And then I think he lost in the playoffs he lost to Bront quite convincingly. Definitely let down by that, and just a couple of other players sort of dropping off. But a good draft overall. Solid top 4 plus another player who put in reliable hours. Drafting his ult, always a good decision. I can't remember how his mid-season went. Crush, Fishy and Pitley, I don't think he really got much out of those three, so not the greatest, not the most mileage out of them. Probably could have looked a bit closer at the available players, but overall, good participant, always got his teams in on time, which I appreciate. And then we get to the other cripple team, the other GIMP team, which was the level 3 team, which exceeded my expectations. Obviously managed to take that week 5 Battle of the Cripples victory. Unfortunately, I was really looking forward to trying to grab the win that week, and we were looking close for a while, but unfortunately, young Orange Head got his first and only start of the season, and he doesn't play RuneScape, so it kind of screwed us over there. I'd like to say a big fuck you to everybody who picked Orange Head to start for Team Hexus that week. We could have finished 2-9, which would have been awesome, or even 3-8 if that final week had gone well, but that's not the team I'm talking about. I'm obviously talking about Team Quaffle. Hockey Guy 456 or JCW was a good first draft there. I remember he was looking to pick up Age, who was taken in round 5 there, who at the beginning of the season was putting up big hours. He's been dropped, so he's not going to appear on any of the sheets. But early on in the year he was putting up some decent hours. I don't know if he actually played him though. We go 57, 59. These would have been good, valuable hours for Team Quaffle to maybe push them up to a bit. Or maybe not. Actually, these are pretty hearty defeats. Maybe could have helped in that one. And then when he did pick him up in the mid-season, he wasn't playing quite as much. I think he'd actually almost quit entirely, so that was unfortunate, but still good on him. He was always nice and prompt with his team submissions. Again, I appreciate that in the managers, and stuck with it right to the end. So it was 11th place Team Quaffle 8. And then we go into Team Randalicious, who came into the season with big expectations and left a bit disappointed and honestly seemed a bit disinterested. For a guy who talks about poor managerial skills and not submitting teams, I'd like to note that he was probably the worst in terms of submitting his teams by the deadline, and ended up with quite a few randomised teams playing near the end of the season, which it basically already qualified for playoffs, so you can kind of say, it didn't really make a difference, but it could have pushed him into a better spot for playoffs and got him a better matchup or something. So a bit annoyed with that, really. He's another one of those ones who got a bit unlucky with some things. He got entirely fucked over by his first round pick, Sheldon quitting. And then 2277 Alba is back, also sort of quit after a while, who was also putting out, there's 92, 73, 89, 68, and then it just sort of starts to slip off and he doesn't play anymore. But he was a valuable player early season, and losing him early on definitely was a big loss. He made a couple of some of the better moves in the season, picking up Paul No Life to use him late in the piece as he finished runecrafting, and his one-time appearance of Ned Flanders, who lay on the floor and did Nightmare Zone for a week to clinch a victory against the unfortunate Team Stagzor. Don't think Ned ever played again, but it was a good move and it worked out. So there was that. He ended up finishing 7th. Not 7th. I should update that. He finished 6th. I guess I didn't update the standings in the last week. But yeah, 6th overall. Lost to, who would it have been in the playoffs? Would have been Vyers, wouldn't it? Yeah, lost to Vyers in the playoffs quite narrowly. And I'd like to note that if he'd actually submitted his team, he almost certainly would have won that, because he unfortunately did not submit his team in the last week, and he could have quite easily qualified for the semi-finals if he had. So Anybody on Team Rendelicious who wanted to do better than they did, make sure to blame your glorious manager for his poor managerial efforts. Then coming on to the most unfortunate team of the season in Team Stagzor. Drafted well, it's a solid top 3, and that's where, after that, things started to go a bit sour. This was probably maybe the third worst drafting decision, to pick a guy who had quit and whose face is probably pasted on Modweth's wall in sort of a do not allow to play ever again sort of section. And I don't know, I genuinely do not know what he was thinking drafting XD, but he made maybe the best drafting decision of the season, picking up One-Eyed Owl in the seventh round, wasn't it? 7th round, who finished overall 7th overall with the third best average. He also picked up Pot Often with the 2nd best average. That is some flashes of brilliance. His last round draft there had a 100-hour average across the 7 weeks that he was played, and often he wasn't played because near the end of the season he was another one of the managers who would fail to submit his lineup. And I asked him, hey, do you want to continue? And he said no, so I just began to submit his top 7 in EHP for the last couple of matches. If things had gone slightly differently a couple of the weeks, he could have quite easily made playoffs. There's a 15-hour loss, 18-hour loss, 14-hour loss, 2-hour loss, 30-hour loss, 1-hour loss. These are very, 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 very narrow margins. And I think if he had made it into the finals, a few of these players would have been able to really go in and put up big hours to push him to the semis or maybe even the final. So I got to feel bad for him in that respect, but he did get beaten by teams who are obviously better. So that's the 8th place Team Stagzor, finishing 4 and 7. And then finally, Team Vyers, which was for me the surprise of the season. He did well. He obviously drafted well, got 3 good top picks and another couple down the line. I don't know. I think Soft Bear was one of his mid-seasons. Must have been he dropped Dalton. Good choice. Picked up a guy he never played and another guy never played. But yeah, Team Vyers did well. He was always nice and prompt with his team submissions. He was always able to communicate with me if he was having trouble with something. I appreciate that, seeing as he was the one I was most iffy on putting as a manager because I'd never talked to him before. I didn't know who he was, but he seemed quite excited to give it a shot. So I gave him the go-ahead, and he finished up 3rd overall and probably 3rd in playoffs. Just overall putting up a good standing, taking out 9 wins, only 2 losses to Xlix and another one to Duration there. So overall a good season with good drafting. Picking up Lesby in the 7th round again, very valuable. Macross in the 10th round would that have been. Looking at Vyers, yeah, both great drafting decisions there. Overall a good team and certainly one of the more effective teams. In terms of individual players, which I'd also like to go over, we had some very strong showings from some players. Ardinio, 104 average, 101 average, 99 average there, 100 average there, 86 average from Pano. Again, he was very unfortunate to lose him. You go down the line, the averages sort of sink a bit, quite unfortunately. It's a bit curious, Team Duration had 3 of the worst performing. I mean, it's a high average, but 3 of the worst performing players, despite also having 3 of the top performing players. So interesting drafting, but it obviously worked out. Looking at the places people drafted, and I think it was interesting. this is obviously the single most standout drafting decision. Drafting him 84th overall to get a 100-hour average, drafting him 133rd overall to get a 100-hour average. That's hugely advantageous, but unfortunately, nobody else from his team was quite able to fire at the same level. But yeah, overall, some really, really strong performances. Look at a lot of players averaging above 80 and above 70, which is sort of like the level you want a player to be at. And I think you can see, where is he? 22nd, but first draft pick. And there's no one else that really comes close to. You got where is he? Isley Broad's 10th, finishing 50th is not great, but picking Lynx Titan in the first round was not a good pick in my opinion. And so yeah, it's how the final sort of standings looked. If I haven't gone over this yet, I don't think I have. Fairly top heavy, fairly competitive. Having two teams on 10-1 and two teams on 110 isn't great, but I don't really think you can aim for the 50% win rate ideal in a competition in something like this, which is what I'd like to now transition into, talking about the format as a whole, and how I think it went. And I think it went well. In terms of the job I did personally, I think I failed in a couple of areas. Most of all, communication, definitely. I'm not great at talking to people, and I'm not great at sort of hyping events up, so I don't think the league itself got quite as much publicity as it did the previous time, because I'm not as much of a people person as trance music was. I'm not quite as much of an exciting person, but it had a decent enough sort of following and it went pretty well. But when I talk about communication as my main failing, mostly talking about being available, not really being available to talk to, but being approachable to talk to maybe. I was always available. I always had all forms of communication open. But for some reason people just didn't quite want to contact me with things about the season. In particular, about a lack of interest from managers. Instead of talking to me saying, hey, I'm not really interested in managing anymore, they just sort of dropped off. And if they'd told me, as soon as they weren't interested, I could have arranged a new manager for them, and maybe things would have turned out a bit differently. While we're here, we may as well talk about the trades, in particular probably the most controversial trade of the season, which was, where am I looking? This one. Team Duration trades Age and Dreamworld to Team Marco for Zunka. This happened before the mid-season, I think about week 6. At this stage Froggen was quite uninterested in things, and I didn't know this. He was still playing a decent amount, he was still sort of submitting his teams, but he wasn't very interested in the competition as a whole, and he managed to get convinced by his player to trade that player to a quote-unquote better team, which potentially resulted in Omar taking it out, but I'm not one to look at what-ifs. And I don't think the failing was in accepting the trade, like me accepting the trade and letting it go through. I think that the failing was in the managers accepting the trade and the managers allowing the trade to go through. The fact that he didn't see me as someone to come to and say, hey, I'm not interested, but instead he just sort of traded away a very good player and sort of threw the season into a bit of disarray. But I'm not going to go back and say, oh, maybe this should have been there, this should have been there, because it's all in the past, and I think I did an overall decent job. I had to intervene with Xlix's repeated trades for similar players, and I also turned down another trade that Omar tried to pull off of. He was trying to trade Skinker and Dan S for Team Stagzor's Pot Often, which is an even more uneven trade than the Marco one. Just sort of for my logic for why I accepted the trade. As I said earlier, his team was very top heavy. He had a couple of people putting in big hours, but then he was kind of missing a bit near the bottom of his roster. He was missing the solid base. So when I was looking at the trade, he traded, it was a Dreamworld and Age, who were both putting up solid 50 to 60 hours, and so I sort of saw it as I'm willing to trade away one of my higher ranked, better ranked players for a couple of other players who are going to put up a solid base and allow me to get higher hours. I didn't think it was as ridiculous as a potential trade as the best player on this team for the two worst players on this team. And it was an absolute fucking joke that he even thought about proposing that trade. But yeah, that was the only other thing that I directly intervened on. Everything else sort of just flowed naturally. And the competition as a whole, the rules worked for what they were. There are a few format changes I'd like to make if I were to do this again, focused mostly on making it more competitive across the board and placing more value on players, because as it stands right now, there is one type of player. There is the person who gets lots of EHPs in a week. That's it. There's nothing else. Because I wanted to do a type of, rather than doing just a straight snake draft, I wanted to consider doing a credit auction where players would have 10,000 credits, and then they'd bid on players, and then other people could upbid them, blah 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 blah, and then the person who bid the most gets a team, and then they only have so many credits remaining, and all that kind of stuff. But when I stopped and looked at how the format was going to be, it would have been a terrible idea, honestly, because every player has the exact same purpose. So every player would just have the same sort of relative value to their hours, and there'd be nothing really interesting going on with that sort of credits draft. You'd have, your nuke players, your Ned Flanders who's going to come in and do his 100-hour week, and then you'd have your consistent players. But other than that, there wasn't any variety. And so I think if I ever run another season of this, I'd try to introduce that variety to it. One idea that I had sort of later in the season when I was thinking about this sort of stuff was to implement some mandatory slots to each team. So, say each team has the same 12 players, then each week they play the same 7. They play 7 players, but having in each starting lineup, you have to play an Iron Man, or you have to play a free to play, or you have to play a level 3, and then with those players use their game modes system of EHP rather than the overall game mode system of EHP. And what this would do would create value in players, apart from just the people who are putting up big hours, because if you have a mandatory Iron Man slot, you pretty much need to have at least one Iron Man who's going to be able to put up decent hours, if not a second one who you can put in if the first one is away, and it just adds that additional level of depth to the format, and I think that could be a potential improvement. The only thing I worry about is the depth of the player bases within those game modes. So I thought maybe it would be one Iron Man slot and one free to play / level 3 slot where you're able to play one or the other in that slot. I just think that would add another element to the drafting and the managerial side of things. In terms of the trading system I went with, I think it was a better decision overall. I wanted to. So the first season, you could drop and pick up, I think it was 3 players every week, and that just led to a whole lot of chopping and changing, a whole lot of in and out rosters. Teams didn't sort of have that solid roster that went through the whole season and won it together. And also it was a whole lot of work for Trans when he was managing, and if I'm honest, I'm a bit lazy and I didn't want to do that. But I don't think that was a positive sort of feeling for the competition. I didn't like the idea of it overall, and so I implemented the trading. So I kept the trading system, which was there the first time, but I introduced a free agent week, which took place in week 6, or week 7 after 6 weeks, and I think that format was successful in terms of allowing teams to remain solid, but it did sort of create a very distinct divide in terms of the teams that were able to do well and the teams that weren't, because it was difficult for a team who wasn't doing well early on to sort of recover, because they had to wait 6 weeks for the mid-season and there wasn't much they could do other than the limited trading options to pick it up and pick up a couple of power players who could put in some big hours. But I think maybe with a couple of revisions, maybe introduce a second, like have 2 free agent weeks spread throughout, just to sort of give that ability for lower ranked teams to do better. And maybe, because for the mid-season draft, what I did is I just reversed the draft order from the first one, and I think looking back, I'd consider giving draft order in the mid-season draft based on the standings. So, first draft, second draft, third draft, first round sort of thing, just to sort of create a more competitive atmosphere where there's more varied results, because after like the first sort of 4 weeks, every matchup you sort of had an idea of who was going to win. There wasn't too much, or will they, won't they? That was obviously the highlight of the season there, but overall you could kind of look at each round and that's a competitive one. Paws is going to beat Hexus, Vise is going to beat Quaffle, Bront was always going to beat Joa, Randy was always going to beat an out of form Marco, and Stiggs was always going to beat Meffer. So you look at that week and you just think, that's what's going to happen. There's not so much that sort of competition, and I'd like to think of ways to remedy that. But outside of format changes, I don't really think there's anything you can do. Because you can't really. It's also an issue of motivation for the players, because you can't really motivate the players with anything other than just straight up you desire to win, and I don't think that it should be done any differently. I wouldn't want to offer a GP prize for the winning team, or for the winning manager, or for the whatever, all that kind of stuff, because then that's when things start to become too competitive and people start to be a bit sneaky, a bit devilish, and not quite playing by the rules. And I really don't want that kind of stuff happening in something as sort of simple as this. I don't know. I think the issue of intrinsic motivation in a league like this will always be there, because it's not entirely stood off like a traditional sports fantasy league, where the players in a sports fantasy league have that desire to succeed and do their best every week because they're involved in the actual league. While in this, the players often don't have that sort of desire to compete and do well every single week. And so the managers that are able to motivate people will succeed, which it's a bit of an advantage in of itself, given to managers who are willing to talk to their team. But I don't know how to manage motivations in this, and I probably can't be bothered figuring out a solution. But overall, I think the season went well. Generally competitive, a lot of close matches, a lot of certain outcomes, but a lot of close matches. A lot of people put up some big hours. I'd like to hope that people are inspired to play more by Fantasy HP. And if I'm still around, I'd just like to give a quick shout out to One-Eyed Owl for winning, I think, the most individual weeks across the season. Good on him for a round 7 pick. But yeah, if I'm still around this time next year, I'd like to think about hosting it again with a few format changes, but I don't know at this point. wasn't too much work once I got the systems down and I was able to automate things fairly quickly. I might change the reset time because the weeks were ending and starting at 11 a.m. my time, and I'm busy from 8 a.m. till 2:30 p.m. So I couldn't often. I wasn't contactable during that period, so it was a bit irritating. Might change if I were to run again. I might change that starting time to something that suits me a bit more, which I think is fair enough. But other than that, successful season. Big thanks to all the managers who participated and put in, the minimal amount of effort it takes to submit a 7-player lineup each team, which was staggeringly difficult for some of them. But it was a good season, and see you next year.